But if we kind of go back, that knowledge was also produced. So knowledge production is as much as a job of academia in a university as knowledge transmission. And all of you are potentially, or even at this point, maybe participants in such a process of knowledge production. Okay? Knowledge production is everything. It is not only science, humanities, etc. It is all the other ways by which common or local human knowledge is enhanced or expanded. So we are talking about a very broad definition here. But there's also formal knowledge production, which are within spaces which are universities, research institutes, etc., academia as we call it broadly. If you pick up books, mostly the books we see around us, most likely they would be written by white men. Something like this. Like white is important, men is important. And there is something odd about that, because knowledge is produced from a certain site, the site being typically Euro-America, which is Europe, North America. And this is not going to be a long kind of rhetoric against Euro-America, so kind of just giving you that. But that has been typically the books you read, etc., right? Which means that is knowledge, but the world of knowledge is then excluding a lot of knowledge which is also common human knowledge, or would bring in the kinds of knowledge which have not been produced, or the kinds of factors which should be factored into knowledge production, which in a certain location doesn't occur to you. It's not conspiratorial necessarily. Okay. So which is why there needs to be a democratization, broadening if you will, of sites of knowledge. And I mean geographical sites here. Okay. Because the moment you have geography, you have the locality starting to talk to knowledge. For example, you're in Chittagong, right? It's a port city. It's a very old port city with hundreds of years of maritime interactions and cultural mingling. I mean, long before the great ports of the world were even ports or even cities. So that's the site we are, right? So if you walk around the port area, the fact is that even people we call Bengalis, quote unquote, around here, why do they look so different and varied? This is a port city. We will come to that later on in maybe the discussion we have in the evening. But so that's about site. But then there's also the idea of social location. So a society has many things interacting. For example, rich, poor, in our societies, color grades, in our societies, religion, in our society, different kinds of access barriers, etc., right? So, which means that if we are not expanding the social location, expanding knowledge, the social location of knowledge, then we are essentially talking within a very small group of people. Now this comes with a different problem. The problem is, so I studied in in West Bengal, where I am from, is what we call the Bengal board, right? It's not an international syllabus. So we were, in a certain scheme of things, second-class citizens. Okay? And what that means is we are always looking up to these first-class citizens who may be physically located in a certain space, but essentially are appendages of a certain other society, which is fine. Which is fine. One can choose to be part of whatever society they want. But if they are doing all the knowledge production in a certain site, then there's a problem. Because then a lot of knowledge which needs to be produced is being catered to the needs of a certain strata. But the society has so much other things, right? So if you go to Euro-America, the phenomena is quite different. For example, Edison, who is known to be a great inventor and a scientist, an innovator, he worked his way up. He was not producing fine lace. He was producing mass products which would make lower middle class people's lives easier. Now you cannot know that need unless you have the experience of being in that problem, right? So which means that the more a society has vertical mobility, you are in a certain strata and kind of moving up, the more you are likely to know a greater part of society and its needs. And knowledge production is always tuned to that. We have an idea of knowledge production as if it kind of exists in this secure space and it has nothing to do with the world, but of course it does. It has to do with, we are of course built by these times, what we need, what we want. For example, the fact that we can think of space research now, or things like that, because space research has happened and has become the agenda of certain people to do certain things, right? But the fact that there are, let's say, post 1990 or 2001 Islamic studies in all Euro-American departments is not accidental, right? It may be fundamental research, but the fundamental research has a social basis outside of the academia, a need that society it's catering to, right? So, which is why I've already covered the relationship of knowledge producer, academia, you and me, with the knowledge consumers. And if the knowledge consumers are always a strata, we are kind of excluding a large part of it. But there's also a power relationship. If the knowledge consumers and the knowledge producers are from the same group, then what happens to the bodies through which knowledge is produced? And this is specifically true for biomedical fields, where, for example, if you are to find a new medicine, if you are to innovate something, you need to work on bodies, often human bodies, right? Clinical trials, for example, are a great example. So we will cover that in some detail. So beyond Euro-America, what you would have is the majority world, right? Majority, I mean majority of people. So intellect or innovation, I believe, is a function of number. I know something, you and I together know more, and we three together know more, or can innovate more. We four can innovate more than I could. It's just, basic, right? So if more people are interacting, that is probably the only idea of knowledge complexity you can talk about, which is not controversial. Everything else is very subjective. Ideas of progress, development, or whatever. So, in what volume is formal knowledge being produced? From the global south, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, China. Nowadays, very large. Quality, very bad. Huge numbers of plagiarized stuff. Huge numbers of research which nobody cares. How do you know nobody cares? Because they're never cited. Citation is when in your research you say, hey, I'm building up on that, or hey, look, he did that or she did that, right? If you are completely irrelevant, I'm not saying that's the only index of knowing somebody's work is relevant, but it's way more likely that something is irrelevant in a broader sense if you're never cited. And these are also the sites, geographical sites, from where academic knowledge is more likely to be self-cited. So I am saying, hey, look at my earlier work, and look at my work now. So that's kind of not very useful. So, and which also hurts the kind of credibility a whole geographical site has in the realm of knowledge production. Does that make sense? Because if you are having a lot of stuff which is just copied from somewhere else and which nobody cares about, well, then the rating goes down. Obviously, I mean, it's not rocket science. And rocket science is not that complex, you know. Some people do rocket science. So, and guidelines. But also remember, people who are doing research in certain areas, it matters who is defining what is social need. For example, think about cancer research in, let's say, Boston, where I was. So there's a lot of gene therapy research which goes on there. Therapy using genes. You change the genes and do stuff. If you change the genes, you come up with a product. A whole infrastructure already exists which can then take it from the lab bench, if you will, from the lab to the clinic to the patient. It's pre-existing. So when you are doing genetic research of a certain kind, it is not in abstraction. It is not in isolation. It has that whole supply chain, if you will. It's a very popular word in Bangladesh, I found out. But a whole supply chain which is already pre-built. Now if I'm doing that in Bangalore, it's fundamental research, it's human knowledge, but it's not for humans who live around that institution. It's kind of an outsourced bit of knowledge which is only immediately relevant somewhere very far away. So we have to think about, I'm not setting an agenda here. What I'm saying is we have to think about knowledge production a little more critically. What am I doing? Who am I doing this for? Who might benefit from it, etc. So, and here, since I already am entering the idea of bodies through which biomedical knowledge is produced, we have to talk about what's happening at present and what will happen in the future. So at present, if you will, clinical trials all over the world are a great business. All over the world in the sense that companies headquartered typically in Europe and Northern America are setting up clinical trials, typically in Brazil, India, I don't know about Bangladesh, probably are, and various other places. If we are doing research on humankind, we have to ask, why are humans in Indonesia or India or Brazil more probable candidates of clinical trials? Right. Of course, clinical trials happen in these countries too, where they're headquartered. But even then, there, it is also predictable who in the social strata are overrepresented among the subjects of clinical trial. Poorer, ethnic minorities, etc., etc. Right? So, though the written word of law is this is research for human beings, a certain kind of human beings are overrepresented on whose bodies these research happen. Is that accidental? We'll try to understand. Okay. So can anybody tell me what's the full form of this? Yeah, go on.
Western educated, independent, rich, democratic.
Yeah. I was independent?
No, independent.
Probably not, because I have forgotten. This was a way to actually outsource what I just forgot at this moment. But you get the idea, right? So you could also say this is Western. E can be actually educated or English speaking. If you look at the volume of knowledge which is produced all over the world, it's also related to that. For example, my department at Harvard used to teach German as an essential entry point into brain and cognitive science, because so much of the earlier literature before the Second World War used to be in German, so you would have to know that. And now the dominance of English is complete, right? So, I completely forget, but democratic, right? So, those are weird subjects, and non-weird ones, which is kind of, the rest. And I've already covered that. So now we will go on to lots of experiments which have happened and which are very crucial. So, first of all, we'll go to the Tuskegee experiments. Did I pronounce that right? Tuskegee? Right. So, the idea was that syphilis is an STD, a sexually transmitted disease. You don't hear of that too much, especially because the incidence has really gone down after the discovery of penicillin, which has been extremely effective to kind of stamp it out. So the idea was that some people, when the treatment of syphilis was already about, some people were denied treatment because you would want to know what happens. How does a disease kind of show its full flourish if you deny treatment, right? And it only came to light much later that such a thing of such a scale had happened. And of course, the subjects who underwent no treatment inside the scope of this study were misguided about what was going on. They were told they had syphilis, but they were informed they had bad blood, which means they did not have good reasons to also seek alternative treatment. Syphilis was a known thing. And this is happening in America, where the word syphilis is known. It's not, Papua New Guinea, where the word syphilis or diseases doesn't come with that name. Of course, people know about disease everywhere in the world. And 28 people died directly from syphilis. It started went on for 40 years, 72 is very interesting. This is after, civil rights movement and everything. As if that never happened. The study goes on all through this period, right? And then 28 patients died, 100 died from complications related to syphilis, 40 patients' wives were infected with syphilis, 19 children were born with congenital syphilis. It's a scandal. Okay. Is it accidental? What's written there in the first line? Many African Americans were majorly the subjects in this study. Well, we will see. We don't know, but this happens to be so. Then we also come to studies. This is in apartheid era South Africa, where shock treatment of homosexual undesirables were used, large-scale studies. So I'll just read through it essentially. Using army psychiatrists and military chaplains, interesting combination, right? Who were presumably privy to private confidential confessions. They flushed out homosexuals in the armed forces, but did not evict them from the military. Were sent to a military hospital, ward number 22, and between 7 and 89, many were subject to chemical castrations and electric shock treatments. By the way, electric shock treatment is even now used in certain contexts to cure homosexuality. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, there was an Indian politician from the liberal state of Goa who said that he plans to set up treatment centers to cure people of homosexuality. Now, of course, he took it back within a very small period of time, as misrepresented in press. But I think he took it back because now there's a whole environment to which he cannot get away by saying that. And I think that's a useful shift, right? He has to take it back or say I was misrepresented. 20 years ago, he wouldn't have to take it back or say he was misrepresented, right? So that's good. And that's what happened, right? So here we're again talking of a certain minority.